Today on Fortnite, I got second place. I was so close.
Mom, will you get me a snack?
Mom! It's time for adult conversation. With me, your host, Brandy Ferner. Hello, Adult Conversation podcast listeners. Today on the podcast is someone who rages at many of the same things I do. I would say the most important things. Kristen Howerton from the Rage Against the Minivan blog and book stops by and we laugh our way through our conversation about some pretty deep things, such as infertility, divorce, toxic positivity in the face of miscarriage, and coping with life's unknowns. You know, just some light topics. We also talk about the pandemic, the similarities between it and Kristen's past struggles, as well as what parts of ourselves this crisis is bringing out. Is pandemic me the real me, or is non-pandemic me the real me? Kristen also gives me a lesson on faking it till I make it. She tells us about a mantra that helped her get through the hardest moments of her life and lets us know how she's keeping her sanity as an introvert who's now home with her kids 24/7. Same. On to the show. Today on the podcast, I am giddy with excitement to welcome my guest, Kristen Howerton, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist, creator of the hashtag #AssholeParent meme, an Instagram account, and the founder of the blog and now book titled Rage Against the Minivan. Welcome, Kristen. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Well, thanks for having me.
Of course. I have to tell you that I'm giddy for a few reasons, but one is because I spent the last 2 days reading your awesome book, and on every other page, you mentioned something that made me go, oh my God, she is me, I am her, we are one. This happened so frequently, and I almost messaged you when it was happening, but then I was sure you would cancel today's interview because it would have been so many messages like, I had shingles at Christmas too. My kids, we made up a song called Shingle Bells. There were so many specifics. So I held in all of my like, oh my God, we're best friends for right now. But we basically hate the same things, which I'm going to list some of them here because anybody who listens to my podcast has heard me rail about these things. But things such as homework before 6th grade, birthday party goodie bags.
Stop it all. Burn it down.
Volunteering at school. I am such the I'll bring napkins and I'll do the thing that I can do at home. The resistance of toddlers. This one was so specific. The lack of stability when trying to give birth in water. I didn't know that was going to happen, but I had the same thing you did. Like, well, now I can't actually like hold on to anything.
You're just floating around like a buoy in labor.
Totally. And I thought getting in the shower would feel really good. Everybody had told me that. And then I got in the shower and I was like, but I'm wet now.
Nothing feels good.
Nothing.
Totally.
Yes. So there's that. And then the motherfucking elf on the shelf, my nemesis, waking a sleeping child ever and living life before 10 a.m., which maybe you'll notice I scheduled you for 11 a.m.
And you'll notice I was very happy.
Yeah, because 10 a.m. is still just a little too early. So
it's the morning.
Man, there's all of that. So I'm excited to talk to you today because after reading your book, it's like, wow, you have been through so many challenges on the parenting journey. And as I was reading your book, it felt like that infomercial that's like, but wait, there's more. It was like, there's an earthquake in Haiti. Like it just was like, whoa. So you've been through infertility, multiple miscarriages, adoption, divorce, the earthquake I mentioned, questioning and leaving your church. So I really want to pick your brain about the similarities between your past struggles and this current pandemic struggle and ask you what feels similar. And I also would love to discuss some of the lesser talked about, maybe taboo topics that parents aren't always comfortable talking about. So before we get to that, what do the listeners need to know about you?
Well, you have given a good perspective on many of the things I hate. That's my brand, raging against things. But I will give a random thing that I love, which is this is not a big scoop or a big secret, but I am like a musical theater nerd.
Yes.
Like big nerd.
Yes, although I have to call you out because I saw on Facebook you were asking about which songs could go in certain
Yes.
musicals, and there was one in Hamilton, That Would Be Enough. Am I remembering this right?
Yes.
How can
I
you
don't.
hate on that? It's so good. I
Well,
mean,
first of all, I probably don't have any objectivity left because I cannot explain how much we've listened to that soundtrack in my house. Because
right.
my daughters are also musical theater nerds. I've seen Hamilton. I saw it with the original cast. I
Mhm.
then went back to New York with my daughters. Like, absurd. Like, they can't go to college now because we kept going to Hamilton. And
Right.
sorry,
Worth
kids.
it. Worth it though.
There's your college fund. We went to Hamilton instead. But this is terrible. I hope Lin-Manuel never hears this. I don't know if he listens to your podcast.
He's a regular listener, so he will.
Well,
It's fine.
I'm sorry, Lynn. I don't think he's the best vocalist, which I'm not alone in thinking that. He's
I
not.
agree with you. Yeah.
And that's one of those songs where, on the soundtrack, like he's not rapping, he's singing, and it's not the best. It's
Yeah.
not the best.
Okay. I hear you.
I'm sorry, Lynn.
So I appreciate that take on him because a fellow friend and I were talking. We're both Hamilton fans, and we were talking about that. And what I love about him is he shows everybody in the world that you don't have to be the best at the thing
Yes.
to do the thing. And so when it came on Disney Plus, because I hadn't seen it with the original cast, I was like, oh, wow, this is interesting. And then also like, good for him because his passion and the fact that he was the writer of it makes up
Yes.
for his lack of vocals. For me, I know other people are like, oh gosh, how could that be? But I mean, if you can be a lead in a hit Broadway musical and not be the best singer, like there is hope for everything in this world. If that
Well,
can
and
be
it's
true.
like he wrote the part for himself. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm glad he played the part, and I also saw him in The Heights,
Oh,
and I'm glad I have so much admiration and affinity for him. But that's
Yes.
just one of those songs where it's like in person it works.
Yeah.
But then when you keep listening to it on repeat, it's like we could have auto-tuned this just a tiny bit. Just a tiny bit.
Yeah, okay, maybe you're right on that. Okay.
But I'm also, in addition to being a theater nerd, I'm also a choir nerd.
What?
Like I was choir all through high school.
So if
All
you're a
the
choir
choirs.
nerd, does this mean are there choirs that you follow? Like how do you live out your nerddom in being a choir nerd?
Well, it's tough. It's a challenge. It's a challenge.
Is there shunning? Is there public shunning that happens?
Well, I do actually do a thing called Beer and Hymns, which is me and a group of friends. We get together and we play old school hymns that we grew up on. And we play them in a bar in this sort of rowdy and irreverent and raucous experience where everyone is holding a beer and singing old hymns at the top of their lungs. So that is a
Whoa.
little bit of my choir fix,
Okay.
doing beer and hymns. And then have you ever heard of choir?
No, but it
Okay.
sounds amazing.
We're doing a deep dive.
Okay.
You did not expect, you were not signing up for this when you brought me on, that I was going to do a deep dive in
I sign
choir
up for
culture.
everything. Yeah, let's do it.
Choir is an experience where these two guys go around and they will take over, like in Costa Mesa, they took over the Segerstrom Music Hall, which is, you've probably been there before. I mean, it's
Yes,
just
I have seen
beautiful.
Hamilton there. Yes.
Yes, it's a beautiful theater. Everyone comes and they hand out worksheets, and then you work for an hour on one song with choir parts that they then post to their YouTube.
Oh.
So you're part of a choir. It's super fun. And they do like pop songs. Yeah,
Oh.
it's really fun.
I just love that the name, like a name so great, it has to be 3 times the choir. Like
No, it's not just
I'm on
choir.
board at choir,
Yeah.
and then the second choir is like, oh, and then the third one, I'm like, I can't take this seriously, although it sounds amazing.
No, we're just going to do
Which
3.
is perfect.
Yeah, the 3 is measuring your commitment. If you're out at 2, you're not part of it. You're not in enough.
That's right. Yeah, I feel like that weeds out people pretty quickly.
Yes,
Like you have
it
a rule,
does.
like if you're laughing at 2, like you can't be in
you're
this.
not part of us.
This is amazing. Oh my gosh. Well, I'm about to totally switch gears because I want to dive in deep here right off the bat, because one of the parts of your book that I think will speak to so many women is the part where you share about how you experienced multiple miscarriages. And then specifically how your community didn't like the way you were handling the emotions around them. Like that part was wow. I was thinking there's so many women who go through that, and there's not really like a guidebook for how to feel about that, and then how to be public or not public about that, but then also how to handle when other people have issues with how you're handling it. So will you tell us about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that there were two factors that were sort of laid out that contributed to a number of my friends not handling my own grief around having miscarriage after miscarriage very well. And I think one of the foundational things that I think is true of sort of our American culture, our American dream culture, is that idea of toxic positivity, meaning
thank you.
Everything that is bad, everything that goes wrong in the world is leading to something better. It's that whole, I mean, I even have a neighbor who the other day was like, well, I mean, this pandemic, you just have to look for like what we're all being given and what the gift is and what we're all supposed to learn. And well, it's like, I agree that we have to learn in hardships. I just don't always think things are a gift. I think sometimes shitty things happen, period. The end.
Yes.
And there's not always a greater gift. So, I was in the midst of losing multiple miscarriages and would have friends say things like, well, I mean, if you hadn't had this miscarriage, you wouldn't have adopted Jafta. Or if you hadn't had this miscarriage, you wouldn't have gone on this mission trip to Africa that changed your life. And it's like, even if all of that is true, I still wish I hadn't had the miscarriages. Like, they were really devastating.
Yeah, and those comments are more about the person themselves than you.
Yeah.
Like, that's them trying to make themselves feel like, now we don't have to feel sadness together, is basically what that says, which is not true support or friendship, really.
Well, I think you're right. I think I don't want to sit in the sadness with you, so come out of it because it's uncomfortable. But I think it's also about the other person in so much as I think some people really have a hard time with the idea that suffering in our life is inevitable and often meaningless. I think people have a really hard time with that. And so when someone is in the slump, really in the thick of it, it's like they are uncomfortable watching it because it's challenging their own worldview.
Absolutely. And I think you probably know that more than maybe other people because of your faith background.
That's definitely the second thing that was happening for me, is that I was in a faith community that, I was heavily involved in a church. That was my community of church, but it was also my community of friends. And I think in faith communities, there is often even more of an impetus to make meaning, to very quickly turn it into some kind of a testimony story or recovery story, or like God was glorified through all of this. And I also I'm still a Christian, but I'm really in a place where I push back on those narratives that Christians, when we have hardship, we need to like always somehow find a way that it's God's purpose, because I also do feel, even as a Christian, that sometimes in this lifetime suffering is meaningless. I do think that. I don't think it's always pushing towards some greater plan in God's design, because I don't believe in a God that put an entire earthquake in Haiti to kill thousands of parents and children and loved ones for his greater design. I don't think that God works that way. I think it's a very privileged way of looking at God if you've lived a life where you haven't either had a lot of personal suffering, or you haven't traveled or been enough in places where there is a lot of human suffering that is meaningless.
Right.
And so those two things really set me up for not being in friend circles where people could sit in the pain with me.
Yes.
Which was hard.
Absolutely. Well, and so you talk about in the book about how people at your church were saying to your husband, something like, we're uncomfortable with how she's handling this. So how, okay, like what was the rage like around that? And then how did you handle that?
Well, this was all happening in my late 20s. And so there was rage, but there was also like still a little bit of guilt. I think if this happened now in my 40s, it would just be like straight rage.
Right, just middle fingers all over the place.
Oh, for sure. And I would just be like, I'm out. But, in my 20s, I was like, this makes me mad, but maybe they're right.
Yeah.
This makes me mad, but I don't want to ruffle feathers. This makes me mad, but I still feel guilty. My own theology, my own faith, my own just boundaries were not formed enough for me to have done what I should have done, which was A, tell people off, and B, maybe push the ejector button on some of these friendships, which I ultimately did.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. You had mentioned stepping away from the church and your life and friends that revolved around it, which I think is such a brave choice to choose the right, compassionate human thing at the expense of leaving what you've always known. And I want to talk later about some of how the adopting of your sons maybe led to that. But what was it like forming a new community and friendships? And what was your new updated criteria for friends? Like, what things became deal breakers for you as you evolved?
Well, what it was like was pretty terrible. It was really painful. And I did retain some friends that I had in that very close-knit church community. But I have to say this too. It wasn't just me. Like, it was a very mutual, I think, breaking apart in some of those friendships, because I was pushing on some things that people felt very sacred about.
Right.
I was saying, hey, I don't think that being a Christian should mean that you're a Republican, or I don't know if this whole pro-life thing, if we're doing this the right way. And I think pro-life probably means like access to birth control and education around birth control. Or I ended up feeling very differently than most of my Christian friends at that time on matters of, LGBT issues and affirming LGBT people in the church. And, I'm very pro LGBT, like not like love the sinner, hate the sin kind of thing. I'm like, come on in and get married in the church, is where I'm at. So people were pulling away from me as well, because again, when you are challenging things that they hold very dear, some people just feel like, I don't want to be friends anymore because this is upsetting to me. This is making me doubt my own self. And so a part of my criteria, honestly, was people who accepted my newly forming beliefs and didn't have any issue. It doesn't mean that they had to agree with me.
Yes, right.
But they had to see me as a person, not as a set of beliefs.
Oh, so true. Yeah. As somebody who also experienced infertility, it's I don't know of a better word than mindfuck, but it's a mindfuck to want something so badly and focus on it for so long. And then when you finally get it, to want a break from it.
Yes.
That part of your book so resonated with me. And the way that you were talking about how there's people out there that were like, don't you just want to wake them up sometimes? And how you were like, F no.
Yeah.
Like I was, and I had a couple friends like that who would say that when I put them to bed at night, I'm just so sad that they're asleep. And this is when, like, during toddler years. And I'm like, what is wrong with me that I don't feel this way? So that part of your book totally resonated for me. And then the realization you had about being an introvert, even though you were outgoing and social, that you needed that alone time to recharge. So will you tell me about how that realization changed how you viewed yourself and your needs as a mother?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you said, I think that any of us who came to motherhood the long way around, which is a lot of us, whether it's multiple miscarriages, infertility, prolonged adoption, or maybe, not being in a partnership where you could have kids. That's so many of us. Like, so many of us didn't have a linear, like, one day saying, I'm ready to have kids. And then in 9 months, you have your kids. Like, that doesn't
that's what we thought it would be.
Right.
That's what we were scared that it would be. Everybody scared us that you could get pregnant so easy. I'm like, you all have been lying to me for years, because I could have been having lots of unprotected sex and you've ruined my life. Thank you.
It's funny. I remember there was a blog that I used to read back in my infertility days, and I think it was called something to the effect of like all that wasted birth control.
That's exactly right. Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I think that those of us who came to motherhood the long way round can really struggle with guilt when we then feel the very normal experience of being tired of our kids or wanting a break or feeling overwhelmed, because it's like, well, I worked so hard for this. I prayed for this. I asked for this. I begged for this. And now I'm tired of them. What's wrong with me?
Yeah.
And so I would just say, for anyone listening who came to motherhood the long way around, you get every right as every other mother to complain, to feel tired. That doesn't preclude all of those normal experiences of motherhood, which is often overwhelming. But yes, for me, I think I had to come to terms with my introversion, which I had never, I'm not shy. I'm not a shy person. I don't mind standing up in a crowd full of thousands of people. No big for me.
Yep.
But you put me in a chit chat conversation and I'll want to die in 20 minutes.
See, this is why we're the same person.
Yeah.
I meet people and I want to be like, what's your darkest secret?
Like, totally.
I'll tell you mine and you tell me yours. And then we can just like connect. It's like, it's probably like unhealthy.
Oh, I know. I feel the same way. I'm like, this was me at preschool pickup. I'm like, oh, you're Ashley's mom. So nice to meet you. So like, what do you think happens when we die?
Yeah.
Like always like
right.
trying to push it deep. I have that reputation with my friends. Like, oh, here goes Kristen. Like, I'm the friend who's like, like, let's get to the meat. Let's get to the real stuff.
Yeah, when people, like, I had a friend yesterday say, like, okay, this is probably too much information for you. I'm like, dude, not possible.
No, there's no such thing.
Not possible. And then when she told me, I was like, that's so tame. Well, who do you think I am? I can go way darker, dude. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, the way that introversion affected me is I also have a much higher need than most people for alone time, just to be completely alone, which LOL in a pandemic, because that hasn't happened in ever.
Yeah, we're going to get to that next. I need to ask you all about that. Yeah.
Oh, good Lord. So anyway, I just realized like suddenly I went from, I mostly worked at home. I had kind of an introverted job to like being around children 24/7. And I feel like the baby stage for me was okay because they're sort of like, they're accessories at that point, like you wear them, you feed them. But once they became toddlers, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm never alone. I'm never alone. And I wanted them to go to sleep. I wanted them to go to bed. I wanted a break. And I just felt like I was living in that. And I felt really guilty about it until I finally, and I talk about this in the book, went to a therapist and she was like, you're an introvert. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. You're not a sociopath, which of course that's where I went.
Right.
That's where I went. I'm like, maybe I have no empathy. Maybe I'm a sociopath. She's like, here's the thing, honey. Sociopaths don't come to therapy and ask if they're sociopaths.
I was just going to say that, yeah.
They're not hand-wringing about their lack of connection with their child 24/7. Like, they're not having those thoughts.
If you're asking yourself if you're a sociopath, you're probably not a sociopath.
You're probably not, right? And you're crying. Like, am I a sociopath? Why am I not loving my kids all the time? That's not sociopath behavior.
No.
But, she like really gave me permission to let myself off the hook and just to be like, this is who you are. And your kids will go off to school. And that was, that's the big joke now in the pandemic is I wrote in my book, my biggest tool in my parenting toolbox is that they go to school.
Totally. And you also wrote, a quote you also wrote is, when people ask me if I would ever homeschool, I just laugh. Which is just
still laughing.
Yep. The biggest joke. I've said that to my friends before too. Like if my life depended on it, I could not homeschool. And it's like, oh, I guess I could.
And here we are.
I call it non-consensual homeschooling because I never consented to this. I was never asked. So
funny. It's so funny. That's so true.
So yeah, I was so with you on the glory that is all the kids being in school all day long. And I had been working towards this goal for 12 years because my kids are far apart. I have a 13-year-old, almost 7-year-old. And I just reached this goal this last school year only to have the pandemic hit. So for those 7 months where both kids were in school with no half-day kindergarten bullshit, yes, I honestly... I felt like I was finally coming out of a hole.
Yes.
Like I even like high-fived my husband and was like, dude, we made it through the roughest part of, I think, our life. I felt like I could finally breathe for a minute. I finally had some balance. So I know for me, this pandemic and the non-consensual homeschooling that comes with it feels like I'm sliding back into that hole, which is awful. And I know a lot of moms are feeling that way. So I'm wondering, because you are similar, how are you doing with kids being home 24/7? What are your coping tools? When you lose your mind, what do you do? How much banana bread are you baking? Like, what's your life like right now?
Listen, I can't even sugarcoat it. I'm going to stay on brand. It's terrible. What you described, sliding back into the hole that I felt I was in when my kids were toddlers, is exactly how I feel. I feel constantly overwhelmed. And my kids they're at relatively easy ages, but it's like, for me to never be able to have them walk out the door and know I'm alone in my house and whatever I focus on, whatever work I have to do, I can at least devote 5 hours to it. Like that's
Yes.
gone. Every single thing I do, I'm interrupted. And so it's just been really difficult for me to try to stay focused and to do work when, it's like, oh, mom, what are we doing for lunch? Or mom, I need help getting this Zoom call, or mom, blah, blah, there's always something.
Yes.
One of my coping skills has been that I have had to pull back on work a lot, which
right.
sucks, because then you're making less money and we're all in the midst of a financial crisis as well. I think, closing my door and just kind of having office hours to the best of my ability is one way that I'm coping, but I don't know. It's not great. It's really not great.
I'm with you. You're not alone. I feel the same way. And I felt like I had reached this point where I was so frustrated and resistant about the whole thing that I almost had to give myself an attitude adjustment. Like,
yes.
Listen, Brandy.
Yeah.
You have to accept this.
Yes.
And it's happening. And so I did. I was like, but then I view maybe similar to this, but I was like, I'm like having an argument with myself, but myself says to myself, how am I supposed to just pretend I don't feel this way though? Like, am I supposed to just like pretend and be happy and upbeat, which I laugh at because it's like, yeah, that's what like a lot of people do. That's called like, not being in a dark hole all the time. And so I really had to try to like, okay, I'm going to try to show up here and not be so frustrated. And what I had to do in order to do that is basically not work during the week. Like I had to then try to get my work time on the weekends, but then, so it worked for a while because then I felt like I'm at least not trying to get something that's not working. Like there wasn't that resistance there.
Yes.
But then I was angry because like I basically felt like I gave up all the things that I had worked for in terms of like how I'm building my business and my writing career. And then that I'm just expected that I would give up these things. And it's not expected by employers that working fathers have to give up anything. In fact, their work, like I know my husband's work, has been busier than ever.
Yes.
So you're not alone. And I've been like, how do I handle this resentment and this frustration and this rage, but also live right now? Because I don't want to be angry all the time.
I know. Yeah. I feel like I've had to do like a lot of radical acceptance in the midst of all of this. And one thing that for myself, and I realize it is a huge privilege that I can even say this, it was that I had to pull back and just accept like I'm not going to be as productive. I had a lot of plans for this year. I'm in the middle of a book promotion and I had to go like, some of this just isn't going to happen. It's not going to happen. I'm supposed to be writing all these guest articles and it's just not going to happen. Like I can't write anything right now. My brain, I think every mother is in a brain fog.
Yes.
Like
absolutely.
I can't remember words.
Totally. I mean, I was in the same boat as you with these guest articles. And before the pandemic, it was like I had plans on these ideas for topics and where we were going to pitch. And then when it happened, like there really has been this letting go for me that I'm a hustler. And so I was like, I have little alerts come up on my phone, like, oh, book signing in LA, book signing at Tattered Cover in Denver. And I'm having to miss all these things. But like, I've almost accepted that I'm just not going to do almost all of them. Like it's kind of been like an all or nothing thing for me, and which isn't totally true. And and then I think it's easy to beat up on ourselves and go like, well, this isn't going to be a success because you're not doing anything. But it's like, how can I fight against a pandemic right now? And my nervous system, that's just, it's a lot to overcome. So I feel you on that.
I agree.
And I wonder too, I know that you are no stranger to anxiety and having wild situations happen to you. Like, the things that you talk about in your book. What are some of the similarities between challenges in your past and this pandemic? As to keep your sanity right now, are you drawing upon coping methods you've learned along the way? Is there anything throughout your parenting journey that's now coming to really help you? Like one of the things that I'm thinking about is your mantra in your book, and it seemed like in hard times when you were trying to be present, was what would a loving mother do? Asking yourself that question, which I think is so beautiful because you're not asking what would the perfect mother do.
Yeah.
You're asking, what would a loving mother do? So what things that you've learned along the way are you using now?
I mean, yeah, it's wild because so many of the lessons that I talk about in my book have just been sort of thrown back in my face in the middle of this pandemic. Like, okay, God, like, I get it. Like, I got these lessons already. But I mean, that whole idea of what would a loving mother do, or faking it until you make it, that has been a big part of my parenting journey of just like, even if I'm totally exhausted, how can I show up for these kids in a way that makes them feel loved? And I feel that right now. I'm so exhausted. I'm so tired. And I'm not hiding those things from my kids. I'm being honest about those things. But that irritability that I feel when they need my attention in the middle of the day, there's a
Yes.
lot of me like really asking myself, like, what would I do if I wasn't irritated? How would I respond to this
Right.
like benign and appropriate question from a child at 11 a.m. on a Monday, because they're not doing anything wrong and none of this is their fault. And so I have
Yes,
had
right.
to do a lot of that adjustment of just like, take a breath and think through, how does a loving mother respond to this question right now? Not me as irritable pandemic mom, but like
Right.
loving mom, and it is, a lot of it is faking, but it's like, I don't ever want my kids to look back on this season and remember, oh, that was the season where I felt like mom hated me,
Absolutely. I'm with you. That's been my thing too, is like, how can I make this so that they look back on it and it's not this awful trauma thing? Because
Right.
it's traumatic whether we want it to be or not.
It is.
We can't control
That's
that.
right.
But like, we can also not add to that trauma,
Right.
which is a challenge, which is a huge challenge when we're also in trauma survival mode. So I love that idea that just kind of refocuses everything about what would a loving mother do. And then the faking it till you make it part. Tell me, I need tips on that. How does one do that? How do you do that?
I mean, I think it's that breath. It's that second. It's taking one little second before you react, and being just a little bit mindful of like, okay, my first response is to be like, do you really need help with this right now?
Right.
Right?
Yes.
And it's just taking that breath and then saying, oh, hey, sweetie, what do you need? Because it's faking. That's faking it. Like, if I'm just in my real base self,
Yes.
my response is like, do you really need this right now?
Right. How dare you interrupt me? How dare you ask me to watch this scene in the Barbie show for the 100th time? Yeah.
Or like, how dare you want to be fed?
Oh my gosh.
How dare you need a basic need met?
I know. Mom, I'm hungry. Oh, how dare you?
Totally. So it's just, it's faking it. And then I think when you behave a certain way, when you take a second, you're mindful, you take a breath, and you are less reactive, I do believe that that practice becomes more internalized, if that makes sense. Like,
yes.
As you practice patience, you become more patient. As you practice acceptance, you become more accepting. I do believe that.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. This reminds me of, I heard a tip, I forget where it was from, but somebody was saying how they were always on their kids, like, come on, hurry up or whatever, whether it was like for bedtime or they were getting ready to go in the car, obviously not going to school because none of us are doing that right now. But the person was saying, I think it was a dad even, was saying how he's been doing this thing where before he tells the kid to hurry, he starts counting in his head. And I, my gosh, I don't know if it's a dad or mom, but whoever this person is said that they find that they only get to about 10 before the kid does the thing.
Yes.
And it's been so helpful to reframe for them how easily that they're snapping.
Totally.
And it's just for 10 seconds. That's it. It's not like it's a 5-minute thing. So I have been practicing that and it's actually been
That's
really
good.
helpful. Yeah.
I need to do
That
that.
was really good. So I think you're right. I think that pause, what is the sacred pause? I think that pause is a make or break for our parenting sometimes, for sure.
Yeah. And then the other thing I feel like, that was a big learning in the book was just learning how to let go of trying to control outcomes.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you have to do that with infertility. You kind of have to do that with children in general. Like, we do not control who they become. We really don't. And I think that lesson of learning to let go of controlling outcomes has served me well in the middle of a pandemic where I don't know how long this is going to last. I don't know when they're going to go back to school. I don't know what this is going to do to my business. And just being able to go, I'm going to be okay.
Exactly.
We're going to roll with this storm, and I can't control any of it. So I'm not going to spend my evening trying, which that's not to say that I don't slip up and do that. I do that sometimes.
Of course.
You know,
right.
I got it on the Google hole. Like, when is this vaccine coming out? Come on. Like, let's get the answers.
Well, and I don't know if you feel this way, but I'm finding, and it took me a couple months to realize what was going on, but I'm finding that it's harder to have conversations for me as somebody who understands the unknown, and I'm comfortable in the mess of life. I don't like it, but I definitely can sit with someone through sadness, through frustration. So it's hard during this time to have conversations with people who are so rigid.
Totally.
The people I'm drawn to right now are deep thinkers and not comfortable in the unknown, but at least can acknowledge that we don't have control over all of this.
Yeah.
And so I think this idea about not controlling outcomes, I think it's really relevant for right now.
Yeah, I do too. And I agree. I think that, you know, we're watching a lot of people grappling with that loss of control, and humans don't do well with that. And we're watching it kind of spill out in some really negative ways. I mean, even, you know, when I'm watching these videos being posted of people walking into stores and accosting 20 somethings who work in a grocery store, which makes me so mad. Like, these kids they don't control any of this. Their boss told them to make sure people are in a mask. But as I'm watching these people and I'm feeling so much rage, I am trying to remind myself, these people are scared. They're scared.
Exactly.
They're losing control, and they're scared, and they're being completely inappropriate, but at the root of it is fear.
Absolutely. That's what I've been trying to think about too, because you see people who, I mean, and when you boil it down and you look at them like that are angry about everything, like there's no good options. I mean, I feel that way specifically about school, but you know, it's just like more testing is not normal, but no testing is bad. It's like, and so you look at this and you think, these people are mad at the virus is really who they're mad at. But you can't be mad at a virus because a virus doesn't give a fuck. So instead, your anger spills off into anybody doing anything about it. And that's where I think it's so helpful to be able to look. And I've had to look at this myself with some people, is look and go like, these people are in a trauma response.
They are.
And so I'm going to reserve my judgment about that, because everybody has their own ways of coping. And it doesn't excuse them going into stores and berating workers about wearing a mask or not, but it's just a wild time to see people reacting in trauma mode. And I was asking a friend this the other day, because then you start wondering, well, is this their real self? Or is the other version their old self? And I feel the same way about me. Like, is pandemic me real me? Or is pre-pandemic me real me? And I don't know the answer to that.
Fascinating question.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like, and this could be cynical, but I feel like the pandemic is bubbling up who we are underneath. And I do feel that the pandemic is revealing how much empathy people have, how much collective responsibility people were walking around with. To me, it's a bit of a Rorschach test, you know, and I know that may sound negative, but I definitely feel like I do see the people who've always had a lot of empathy are walking forward with a lot of empathy. And the people who I feel like have been a little marginal, like, you know, and it might have been like slightly annoying before, are the ones who are like, big time not giving a shit about others in the middle of all of this.
Yeah, and I think about too, you know, you have relationships with people, and there can be moments of trauma that happen, or crises, and it's just a quick thing. Maybe it's a day, or, you know, maybe it's a moment, maybe it's a day or two or a week where something's happening, and that version of themselves comes out, and then you move past it because the thing is over. But right now we're in elongated crisis mode.
Yep.
And so it breaks people down. So, I mean, you know, I'm an overthinker. So of course I'm like thinking all about like, is this the real us after all of this? Do relationships go back? Do they not? Like, you know, I could think about this 1,000 ways.
Oh, same. It's fascinating. I feel like we are all in a weird social experiment right now. That's really what it feels like. And I feel that for the kids too. Like, I'm watching my kids grapple, because mine are teenagers, with how their friends are experiencing this and reacting to all of this. And so it's like, it's not just a social experiment for me and all of my friends. It's a weird social experiment for my kids too.
Yeah, and and trying to parent them through it, walk them through it. I know I was having a conversation with my son, and normally everything that he could bring to me is something that I've either been through myself, watched other people go through, have learned about, have read about, have seen a movie about. But this whole pandemic thing, like I told him the other day, I said, we're building the plane in midair because none of us have ever been through a pandemic before. So the things that he's upset about or frustrated about, I can do my best, but I'm trying to get myself through this, but then also trying to parent kids through this. It feels a little bit like fish out of water. Like, wait, I didn't read the book on this part. So it's kind of like what you're saying is like this distilled version of us. Like that's what we bring to the table right now. And is that empathy, or is it not? So all of our true base components of ourselves is what is having to rise to the surface in order to help walk our kids through this, because that's all we've got.
So wild. Yeah.
I want to make sure that we talk about your adopted sons who are both Black, and one is from Compton and one is from Haiti, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So there's a really vulnerable moment in your book where you talk about how you felt at first as a white woman with a Black son, how you felt this pride and almost like you had proof that you weren't racist. And I really admired your ability to share that because I could see feeling the same way and then feeling ashamed of it, but feeling it. And so, and also being naive about the reality of what it's like to be a white mother to Black children. So will you tell us more about that and your evolution into being an outspoken social justice advocate?
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to be really honest in the book because I think my journey from being what I thought was not racist to being an anti-racist, I think it's a journey that is similar to a lot of people, and I think a lot of the feelings that I had were similar to a lot of people. And so, I was raised in a family that my parents were definitely trying to be not racist, but the way that they taught us to deal with that, because they had actively racist parents. And so the way that I was raised is like, we don't talk about race. Like everyone's equal. We don't see race. You don't talk about it.
Right.
Everyone's equal. And I will credit that they did the best that they could for their time. And they did raise us, like all of us, as we started dating. We dated, many races, my siblings and I, and we had friends of many races. Like that played out in that we were looking at everyone equally, like everyone was sort of an equal potential friend or potential dating partner. But I don't think that I had the full understanding that when I was looking at everyone equally, I was not then able to notice inequity, because I was like, we've all been dealt the same hand and everyone,
right.
I'll be friends with anyone, I'll date anyone. But it was like, I didn't quite understand how to see what it felt like for, my super close friend growing up who was an immigrant from Guatemala and was not a native English speaker, or what it felt like for my Black friends and, the racism that they experienced. It took me a while to be able to really hear and really listen and have the desire to listen, to understand the importance of listening. I think I, for a while, was just like, if we can all let go of personal prejudice and personal racism, then we'll all be okay. I realize now that there's so much systemic, right? Like it's baked in. It's baked into almost every system. I mean, I'll even just share from my personal milieu is like, I'm a trained therapist. I'm a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California. And so, when you look at that field, all of our research, all of our sort of founding fathers of psychology, everything is based on white, heteronormative research. And so we have in psychology, we have demonized certain things that are actually cultural. So like there's an idea in American psychology of individuation, which looks like, when you're 18, you should move out and launch, or there's something wrong. And we would, if someone came into our office and it was a man who's 30, who has a wife and his children, and they still live with mom and dad, we would go, well, you haven't individuated. Where in many cultures, that's very acceptable. Like that's the way that that things go. So that's just one example of how like so many of our systems are based in white norms and don't take into account the experiences of others.
Yes. I remember a couple years ago seeing Band-Aids that were a darker color and being like, oh, fuck.
Yeah.
Like people with different skin color haven't had a Band-Aid to match their skin. And it's such a minor thing. And it's like, gosh, a total blind spot. And then I saw this thing go by that maybe many of people have seen on Facebook about a young Black doctor who had a book of, it was like skin issues. And he compiled this book that was what that skin issue or what that disease would look like on Black skin because it was very different. And I'm like, holy shit, I can't believe that didn't exist before. Yeah. But these are all the things that we don't have to know because it's never affected us.
Totally.
Yeah. Wow. So it sounds like after you adopted your sons, there was so much learning that went on for you, even though you had such a great foundation about, being equal and valuing people for who they are. And so now do you do talks? Like, what does your social justice work look like right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my social justice work at this point has always looked like it's kind of like I know, for example, when I wrote my first book, it's called Rage Against the Minivan. It's a humor memoir about parenting. But there are 2 chapters about race in that book. And the reason that I did that was when I initially thought I'm going to write a book. My first idea was I want to write a book about white privilege. And then in talking to my editor and talking to my team, it's like, okay, well, who will buy a book about white privilege?
Right.
And interestingly, I mean, a bunch of people did just buy a book about white privilege because of the George Floyd. But, obviously we didn't know that would be happening.
Right.
And it's like people who are going to buy that book are people who are on board with this idea.
Right.
And so it was more like, listen, you need to write a book that's universally appealing. And then within that book, you can talk about these things that are important to you. That way you're getting your message into the hands of people who would not willingly sign up to buy a book about white privilege or, the problem with being colorblind or things like that. So it's interesting. My activism has always been sort of wrapped in talking about other things and then saying, okay, well, I have you here. Like, thanks for coming to my blog about recapping The Bachelor. But while you're here, let's talk about racism. I've always wanted to bring people in with, and I love talking about The Bachelor, or about motherhood. But it's like bringing people in on points where there's maybe a wider shared affinity, and then talking about these issues that maybe people are not as open to talking about.
I feel like Glennon Doyle did that in her last book.
She sure did.
Let's see. So before we wrap up, let's talk about divorce just for a moment. One of the quotes that you had that I thought was so interesting was you said, when I stopped trying to keep the wheels on my marriage, they pretty much fell off.
Yeah.
And I thought that sounds like a great or awful, but perhaps necessary experiment for someone to do if they aren't sure if their spouse is invested or trying to help the marriage. And will you tell us more about that in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that I was married for 20 years, and I would say the last decade of our marriage, it definitely felt like if I didn't plan a date night would never happen. Or if I didn't sign us up for counseling would never happen. It felt like I was the one who was always initiating any relational connection, with the exception of one kind of connection, which I'll let you guess. Which kind that was initiated by the other person. But, I was definitely feeling like I am the only one steering the ship into any kind of like mental, emotional connection. I kept trying, and it felt like I was just, and as a mom, you're also holding the wheels on for all the kids, and, I'm working. And so it just felt like I was the only one working at the marriage. And so I just kind of got to a point where I'm like, I'm just going to stop and see what happens. Because this is a partnership with another adult. I shouldn't be the only one working at it. And when I stopped, it really did fall apart. Like when I was not saying, hey, let's go to dinner on Tuesday, or let's get a babysitter, or let's, it just, there was nothing there, nothing at all. And then we lived separate lives for about a year. And then I think it was like both of us are like, okay, this is not working.
Was that painful, or did you expect it?
I did expect it. And it was like I needed both of us to see.
Yes, right.
Because it's one thing to say, hey, I'm doing all the work over here. I mean, it's like, let's say that this is a sink, and there's two partners and one partner won't ever clean out the sink. Well, if you're always cleaning out the sink, there's never proof, right? Like, yes. You have to let the dishes pile up. And I think I had to let the dishes pile up. And when I did that, it was like, see, like, this is what I've been saying. And I was right. Like, I mean, sadly, by that point, I think I knew what the outcome would be.
Yeah, but you needed that last clarification.
I did. Yeah, for both of us. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I cannot tell you how interesting I thought your book was, how I really, everything you said resonated with me, like I said.
Well, it's so funny. We just have so much in common.
Well, and the fact that we live in the same county.
I know.
When I heard that, because I had told you when I reached out to you that I'd had a couple people tell me, you need to meet Kristen. And they're from totally different groups. One's a writing group, one's a local moms group. And so then funny. when I don't know where I saw that you were Orange County, I was like, okay, universe, you're forcing this hand, and I will reach out and be the creepy stalker girl. But then reading your book, I was like, oh my gosh, this is why we were meant to know each other, because we are really similar. So I so appreciate you coming on here. So your book details so many other really interesting things. It's so validating. Where can people find you, your book, and your podcast who want to know more about you?
Yeah. So I'm online at KristenHowerton.com, and I am Kristen Howerton on all the platforms, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, just my first and last name. You can find the book anywhere books are sold. And then Selfie Podcast is a podcast about self-care, and we talk about all aspects of self-care, everything from our favorite serums and candles to how to have better boundaries in relationships to what to do with your pubic hair. I mean, like no stone unturned. Self-care.
Amazing. Yes. Do you ever talk about the hatred of the word and the idea of self-care, that we shouldn't need to have self-care, and how broken the system is?
Oh, I mean, that's the whole exploration. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. I mean, it's like we're turning a mirror on the whole industry and the whole idea. And I mean, the more I do, and we've been doing the podcast for almost 2 years, and it's like the more I do it, the more I recognize that self-care is really, I think, more about, it's an inside job. It's a real inside job. So we have a resident therapist who answers questions every week on the podcast, which is really fun. She's super wise. But that's awesome. At selfiepodcast.com.
Okay, awesome. I just have to end with another quote from your book that I loved, which is, most of my worst moments happened when trying to get babies to sleep. Same. For once, I have very little to say after the episode, except something I'm still chewing on is the question, is pandemic me the real me, or is non-pandemic me the real me? I have arguments to support both sides of this. It would be a great debate team topic, if I was in high school on a debate team. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so hit me up on social media and let me know what you think. And feel free to join the Adult Conversation Podcast discussion group on Facebook, where we love to overthink together. If you enjoy the podcast, chances are you'll love my novel, especially right now, while you might need some validation, humor, and a wild trip to Vegas, if only in your mind. Titled Adult Conversation, a Novel, it's a darkly comedic story about the relentlessness of modern motherhood, where the main character seeks an answer to the question, is motherhood broken, or am I? After a series of relatable mom wins and failures, she and her therapist end up on a Thelma and Louise-style road trip to Vegas, where they are tempted and tested while finding lost pieces of themselves that motherhood swallowed up. You can find it in all the usual places, or you can go to my website, adultconversation.com, to find out more. As always, thanks for listening.
Here I am back at the goddamn Zoom.